My name is Marcus Ellison. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a certified county food safety inspector out of Riverside, California. 2 years ago, I was a line cook at a place called Taverna Luca on Magnolia Avenue. I reported a grease trap that hadn't been cleaned in 11 weeks and a walk-in cooler running at 52 degrees. Chef Dante Moretti looked at me in front of the entire kitchen staff and said, "Clean the grease trap or clean out your locker." I cleaned out my locker. Then I spent 2 years getting the one credential that would let me walk back through that door with the authority to shut it down. Last Tuesday was my first official inspection assignment. The address on the clipboard was 47112 Magnolia Avenue, Taverna Luca. Chef Moretti was plating appetizers when I walked in with a badge. I need to give you some background on who I am and where I came from, because the revenge doesn't make sense without the kitchen. I grew up in San Bernardino, about an hour east of Riverside. My mother worked the grill at a Denny's on Hospitality Lane for 19 years. She never missed a shift, never called in, and never once left the flat top without scraping it clean. That's the first thing I learned about food. The cleanup matters as much as the cooking, maybe more. She'd come home smelling like bacon grease and bleach, and she'd still wipe down our kitchen counter before she sat down. She did that every single night until her knees gave out in 2016. I started working kitchens at 17, bussing tables at a Mexican grill on 5th Street, then dishwashing at a breakfast chain off the I-10, then prep work at a tapas bar in Redlands. I moved through kitchens the way most line cooks do, one station at a time, learning each piece of the operation until you earn the right to stand in front of a burner. By the time I was 25, I could run saute, grill, or fry at any mid-range restaurant in the Inland Empire. I wasn't flashy. I was clean, I was fast, and I never sent back a ticket late. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. In 2022, I got hired at Taverna Luca. It was the nicest place I'd ever worked. Real linen tablecloths, a wine list with bottles that cost more than my weekly take-home, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine shoot. Brushed steel, open shelving, a pass window with heat lamps that actually worked. The dining room sat 80. Friday and Saturday nights, they'd turn every table twice. The reviews on Google were solid, 4.3 stars, around 400 reviews, with people talking about the braised lamb and the house-made pappardelle like it was a religious experience. Chef Dante Moretti ran that kitchen like a small country with one ruler and no elections. He was 47, stocky, with a shaved head and a voice that could cut through the hood fan during a full-service push. He'd trained at a Michelin-starred place in San Francisco and never let you forget it. He wore his chef's coat pressed and monogrammed, and he expected every plate to leave the pass looking like it belonged in a photo. He cared about presentation. He cared about speed. He cared about consistency on the plate. He did not care about what was happening behind the walls. I noticed the first problem during my second week. The walk-in cooler had a thermometer mounted on the inside wall near the door. The dial read 48 degrees. Proper cold holding temperature for a commercial walk-in is 41 degrees or below. That's not a guideline. That's the line. Above 41, bacteria doubles every 20 minutes. Proteins, sitting at 48 for a full-service shift, are growing cultures you'd need a microscope to name and a hospital to treat. I mentioned it to the sous chef, a guy named Danny Reeves. Danny was 30, competent on the line, and completely uninterested in anything that didn't appear on the ticket rail. He looked at the thermometer, shrugged, and said it always runs a little warm in the summer. He said to just make sure we rotated the proteins and it'd be fine. That's the first thing you learn when you study food safety. "It'll be fine" is the sentence that precedes every outbreak. I let it go that first time. I was new. I didn't have standing to push back, and in a professional kitchen, hierarchy is everything. The chef is at the top. The sous is below. The line cooks are below that. And the new line cook who's been there 2 weeks is below the dishwasher in terms of political capital. You keep your head down, you work your station, and you earn the right to speak by proving you belong. I earned that right over the next 4 months. I worked saute 5 nights a week, covered grill when somebody called out, and ran prep shifts on Monday mornings when we broke down the weekend's deliveries. I showed up early. I stayed late. I wiped my station down the way my mother wiped her counter. Every surface, every time, no exceptions. The violations accumulated slowly the way they always do. A restaurant doesn't rot overnight. It degrades in increments. One night the dish pit backed up and the sanitizer solution in the 3-compartment sink dropped below the minimum concentration. Nobody refilled it. One morning I opened the dry storage closet and found a case of chicken stock sitting on the floor instead of on a shelf. Direct floor contact is a violation because moisture seeps upward and contaminates packaging. One afternoon, I watched a prep cook slice raw chicken on a cutting board and then, without sanitizing it, start dicing tomatoes on the same surface. Cross-contamination, the kind of thing that sends an elderly customer or a pregnant woman to the emergency room. Each time I said something. Each time I was told to worry about my station. Danny told me once, in a way that was friendly but carried a clear edge, that the health department comes once a year and that nobody had ever failed an inspection. He said it like that settled the matter. It didn't settle anything for me. My mother had worked in food service for nearly 2 decades, and she never once would have tolerated raw chicken residue on a prep surface. She didn't have a certificate or a title. She had standards. I inherited those standards the same way some people inherit eye color. They were just there, wired into me, non-negotiable. By month 6, I'd counted 14 distinct violations that I'd personally witnessed. I kept a list on my phone, dates, descriptions, locations within the kitchen. I didn't keep it because I was planning anything. I kept it because the forensic part of my brain, the part that pays attention to details even when nobody asks it to, wouldn't let me stop. The grease trap was the worst of it. A commercial grease trap needs to be cleaned on a regular schedule. For a restaurant doing the volume that Taverna Luca was doing, turning 80 covers on a Friday, running the fryer continuously for lunch and dinner service. The interval should be somewhere around every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on usage. When I checked the service log posted on the wall above the trap access, the last cleaning date was 9 weeks prior. By the time I reported it, that number had grown to 11. An uncleaned grease trap doesn't just smell, it overflows. Grease backs up into the floor drains. It attracts pests. It creates slip hazards. And in a worst case, it creates a fire risk because accumulated fats near heat sources are, to put it simply, fuel. I'd seen a grease fire at the Tapas Bar in Redlands in 2019. Nobody was hurt, but the suppression system dumped chemical agent across every surface in the kitchen and shut the restaurant down for 2 weeks. 1,100 pounds of food thrown away. The owner cried in the parking lot. I knew what an overdue grease trap could lead to. I also knew that the walk-in cooler was still running warm. On July 14, 2023, I checked the thermometer myself before the start of dinner service. 52 degrees, 11 degrees above the maximum. I took a photo with my phone, time-stamped. I went to Chef Moretti. I did it the right way. I waited until the kitchen was in the lull between lunch breakdown and dinner prep. The window around 3:30 when the line is reset, but the tickets haven't started printing yet. I knocked on the office door. He was at his desk doing inventory on a laptop. I said, "Chef, the walk-in is reading 52, and the grease trap hasn't been serviced in 11 weeks. He didn't look up from the laptop. He said, "Did someone ask you to check the walk-in?" I said, "No." I said I checked it because I noticed the proteins felt warm when I pulled them for prep. He closed the laptop. He looked at me, and I want to describe his face because it tells you everything about what kind of man Dante Moretti was in that kitchen. He wasn't angry. He was annoyed the way someone is annoyed by a fly near their food. I wasn't a threat to him. I was a nuisance. A line cook with an opinion about the infrastructure. A nobody telling the boss how to run his building. He said, "Ellison, I've been running kitchens since you were in middle school. The walk-in runs warm in July because the condenser is 20 years old and the building HVAC can't keep up. It'll come down at night. The grease trap is scheduled. I'll call the service company Monday." I said the proteins in the walk-in were above safe holding temperature right now. I said the grease trap was almost 3 times overdue for service. He stood up. He walked out of the office and into the kitchen. Every cook on the line was there. Danny, 2 prep cooks named Julio and Angel, a pastry cook named Beth, the dishwasher, a kid named Troy who was maybe 19. The entire staff lined up along their stations watching. Moretti turned to me and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Clean the grease trap or clean out your locker." That was the choice. Accept the humiliation of being reduced to a maintenance task in front of every colleague I had, or leave. He knew I would leave. That was the point. The message wasn't for me. It was for everyone else in that kitchen. This is what happens when you question me. This is what happens when you break rank. I looked at Danny, and Danny looked at his cutting board. I looked at Julio, who adjusted his apron and stared at the floor. Nobody said a word, and nobody was going to. I took off my apron. I folded it on my station. I walked to the staff area, opened my locker, pulled out my knife roll and my extra pair of non-slip shoes, and walked out through the back door into the alley behind the restaurant. The door closed behind me with a hydraulic hiss. I stood in the alley next to the dumpster, which smelled like the grease trap nobody was cleaning, and I held my knife roll against my chest like it was the only thing I owned. For about 10 minutes, I just stood there. I wasn't angry yet, just ashamed. I'd been correct about every single violation I reported, and it hadn't mattered. Being right meant nothing without authority. Knowledge without enforcement power is just noise, and Chef Moretti knew that. He knew that a line cook reporting violations was like a passenger telling the pilot how to fly. The pilot has the license. The passenger has a seat. I drove home to my apartment on Arlington Avenue. It was a 1-bedroom above a laundromat that charged $860 a month, which I could barely afford on a line cook's wages, and definitely could not afford on zero income. I sat on my couch and looked at the list on my phone. 14 violations. Dated, described, located. A document that proved I was paying attention. A document that nobody with authority had ever asked to see. That night, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I researched. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I looked up how food safety inspections actually work, who conducts them, what credentials they carry, and what authority they have. And I discovered something that changed the entire direction of my life. In Riverside County, food safety inspections are conducted by environmental health specialists. To become one, you need a bachelor's degree in a related field, or you can qualify through a combination of coursework and experience. The state of California requires candidates to pass the Registered Environmental Health Specialist exam, administered through the California Department of Public Health. The certification process takes approximately 2 years if you're starting from scratch, which I was. 2 years. I looked at that number and I did the math. I was 32. I had no degree. I had a GED and 12 years of kitchen work. But the state of California allows candidates to qualify for the exam through a combination of approved coursework and documented field experience. My 12 years of commercial kitchen work counted toward the experience requirement. The coursework could be completed through community college and approved training programs. 2 years to go from the person who gets humiliated for reporting a violation to the person who writes the violation report that determines whether a restaurant stays open or closes its doors. I enrolled at Riverside City College in September 2023. I took food science, microbiology, environmental health principles, and public health law. I worked nights at a gas station convenience store on University Avenue to pay rent. The kind of job where you wear a polyester vest and mop the floor at 2 in the morning and try not to think about the braised lamb that Taverna Luca was still serving at 52 degrees. I want you to understand what those 2 years felt like because the timeline is where the story lives. Fall 2023. Microbiology. I sat in a classroom with students 10 years younger than me and I learned the names of the organisms that grow in improperly held food. Salmonella, Listeria, Monocytogenes, Clostridium perfringens E. coli 0157H7. I learned their growth rates, their temperature ranges, their incubation periods. I learned that Listeria can grow at refrigeration temperatures, which means even a properly cooled walk-in isn't completely safe if the food has been contaminated during handling. I learned that C. perfringens is called the cafeteria germ because it thrives in large batches of food held at improper temperatures. I sat in that classroom and I thought about the protein sitting at 52 degrees in Taverna Luca's walk-in, and I thought about every plate that left that kitchen during a Friday dinner service. Spring 2024, Environmental Health Law. I learned the California Retail Food Code, which is the legal framework governing every restaurant, grocery store, and food truck in the state. I learned that a food facility operating a walk-in cooler above 41 degrees is in violation of Section 113996, which requires potentially hazardous foods to be held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. I learned that failure to maintain grease interceptors is a violation of local plumbing codes and can be cited under the health permit conditions. I learned that a critical violation, which is any condition that directly contributes to foodborne illness, can result in an immediate reinspection, fines starting at $250 per violation, and in severe cases, permit suspension. I learned the vocabulary: critical violation, non-critical violation, corrective action, risk factor, imminent health hazard, permit suspension hearing. Each word was a tool, and I was building a toolkit the way I'd once built a knife roll, one piece at a time, each one serving a specific purpose. Summer 2024. Field training. I rode along with a senior inspector named Patricia Okafor, who had been conducting inspections in Riverside County for 16 years. Pat was 53, built like someone who'd spent decades walking through commercial kitchens in steel-toed shoes, and she spoke in the same measured, factual tone regardless of whether she was citing a minor violation or shutting down a facility. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lecture. She wrote down what she observed, referenced the relevant code section, and explained the corrective action required. The restaurant either fixed it or faced escalating consequences. There was no argument because the code wasn't an opinion. It was the law. I asked Pat once if she ever felt bad about writing up a small restaurant, a family-run place where the owner was doing their best. She looked at me and said, "I feel bad when a 4-year-old gets salmonella from a chicken nugget because nobody checked the fryer oil temperature. I don't feel bad about writing a citation." That was the moment I understood exactly what kind of inspector I wanted to be. Fall 2024. Exam prep. I studied for the Registered Environmental Health Specialist exam the way some people train for a marathon. 3 hours every night after my shift at the gas station, sitting at the kitchen table with practice tests, and the California Health and Safety Code open on my laptop. I memorized temperature thresholds, time as a control protocols, approved sanitizer concentrations, pest control standards, and the procedural requirements for every type of enforcement action from a routine reinspection to an emergency permit suspension. I passed the exam on my first attempt. November 18th, 2024. Score of 86. The passing threshold is 70. I sat in my car in the testing center parking lot, and I stared at the results screen on my phone for a long time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I sat there and I thought about the alley behind Taverna Luca and the smell of that grease trap and the sound of a hydraulic door closing behind me. I completed the remaining field hours through January 2025. I submitted my application to the Riverside County Department of Environmental Health in February. Background check, reference letters, final review. The whole process took about 6 weeks. On March 14, 2025, I received my badge and my assignment. I was officially a Riverside County Environmental Health Specialist. I had a clipboard, a digital thermometer calibrated to within 1 degree, a flashlight, a set of inspection forms, and the legal authority to walk into any food facility in my assigned district and evaluate its compliance with every applicable section of the California Retail Food Code. My assigned district included a stretch of Magnolia Avenue. I want to be honest about something. I did not request that district. I did not pull strings. I did not ask anyone to assign me to the area that included Taverna Luca. Inspection districts are assigned by the department based on workload distribution and geographic coverage. I was the newest inspector. I got the district that needed filling when I opened my first week's assignment packet and saw 47112 Magnolia Avenue on the schedule. I sat at my desk and I read the address 3 times. I did not smile. I did not feel triumph. I felt something closer to stillness. The same stillness I'd felt standing in that alley 2 years earlier, holding my knife roll, knowing I'd been right and knowing it hadn't mattered. This time, it was going to matter. If you're still watching, go ahead and hit subscribe. I make more stories like this every week, and your support keeps them coming. Last Tuesday, June 10th, 2025, at 9:15 in the morning, I parked my county vehicle, a white Chevrolet Equinox with the Riverside County Environmental Health logo on the door, in front of Taverna Luca. The restaurant didn't open for lunch until 11:30. But the kitchen staff arrived between 8 and 9 for prep. I could see the lights on through the front windows. I gathered my inspection kit, clipboard with the official inspection report form, digital probe thermometer in a protective case, flashlight, pen, my county identification badge clipped to my shirt pocket. I wore khaki pants, a navy polo with the county seal embroidered on the chest, and rubber-soled shoes rated for commercial kitchen floors. I walked through the front door at 9:17. The host stand was empty. The dining room was dim. Chairs still stacked on half the tables from last night's closing. I could hear the kitchen through the swinging doors. The clatter of sheet pans, the hiss of a flat top being heated, the radio playing classic rock at low volume. Sounds I knew like I knew my own breathing. I pushed through the kitchen doors. Danny Reeves was at the prep station breaking down a case of bell peppers. Julio was at the stove. Angel was nowhere in sight. Beth was pulling sheet trays from the walk-in. And Chef Dante Moretti was standing at the pass, plating what looked like a test run of a new appetizer, some kind of burrata arrangement with roasted tomatoes and basil oil. Danny saw me first. He looked at the badge, then at my face, and his hands stopped moving. He recognized me. I could see the moment it registered. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. He said nothing. Moretti didn't look up. He was focused on the plate, adjusting a basil leaf with tweezers. I stood at the entrance to the kitchen line and I said, in the same measured tone Pat Okafor had taught me, "Good morning, I'm Marcus Ellison, Environmental Health Specialist with Riverside County. I'm here to conduct a routine food facility inspection. Who is the person in charge?" Moretti looked up. The tweezers stopped. He looked at my face. He looked at the badge. He looked at the clipboard. And I watched him go through the same recognition sequence Danny had, but slower, because Moretti's brain was processing not just who I was, but what I was now. He set the tweezers down on the pass. He said, "Ellison," I said, "Chef Moretti, are you the person in charge of this facility?" He stared at me for 4 seconds. I counted them, 4 full seconds of a man recalibrating the power dynamic that he'd built his entire kitchen around. 2 years ago, I was the line cook he dismissed with a sentence. Now I was the person with the clipboard and the legal authority to determine whether his restaurant remained in operation. He said yes. He was the person in charge. I said I'll need access to all food storage areas, preparation surfaces, cooking equipment, warewashing facilities, and your employee health policy documentation. The inspection will take approximately 90 minutes. Do you have any questions before I begin? He did not have any questions. I started where I always start, the way Pat taught me. Walk-in cooler first. Cold storage is where the most dangerous violations hide because temperature abuse is invisible until someone checks. I opened the walk-in door and I stepped inside and I took the probe thermometer out of its case. The ambient air temperature registered at 46 degrees, 5 degrees above the maximum allowable threshold under Section 1113-9096 of the California Retail Food Code. I inserted the probe into a container of diced raw chicken sitting on the second shelf. Internal temperature, 49 degrees. I checked a pan of house-made ricotta, 47 degrees. I checked a tray of salmon portions wrapped in plastic, 51 degrees. Every protein in that walk-in was above safe holding temperature. Every single one. I documented each reading on the inspection form. Item, location, temperature, time of measurement. I photographed the thermometer readings with my county-issued tablet. I noted that the facility's own wall-mounted thermometer, the same one I'd read 2 years ago, displayed 44 degrees, which meant it was either miscalibrated or broken. Either way, the facility was relying on an inaccurate monitoring device, which is an additional violation under Section 114157. I moved to the dry storage area, cases of products stored directly on the floor. Violation: an open bag of flour with no date label. Violation: a container of cleaning chemicals stored on the same shelf as cooking oils. Violation of Section 114254(3), which requires toxic materials to be stored separately from food and food contact surfaces. I checked the 3-compartment sink. The sanitizer concentration in the third basin was below the minimum effective level for quaternary ammonium solution, which requires a concentration between 150 and 400 parts per million. The test strip read 90.
Violation: I checked the hand-washing stations. The one nearest the cook line had no paper towels. A hand-washing sink without drying supplies is a violation because wet hands spread contamination more readily than dry ones. I noted it. I checked the grease trap service log. The most recent cleaning date was 11 weeks prior, the same interval that had existed when I reported it 2 years ago. The same problem, the same neglect, as if the clock had never moved. I checked cutting boards. I found scoring marks deep enough to harbor bacteria in 3 of the 5 boards on the prep line. I found a cutting board with visible discoloration that suggested contact with raw protein residue that had not been properly sanitized. I checked the dish machine's rinse temperature. The gauge read 147. Minimum for a high-temperature machine is 180. 33 degrees below compliance. I moved through that kitchen the way I'd been trained.
Station by station, surface by surface, door by door. I opened every reach-in refrigerator. I checked every holding unit. I read every date label. I measured every temperature. I looked under every shelf and behind every piece of equipment that had been pushed against a wall. Moretti followed me. He didn't speak, just watched me write and photograph. He watched me measure temperatures that he'd never measured himself and document conditions that he'd spent years ignoring. At one point, I knelt to inspect the floor drain beneath the fryer station, and I saw him standing above me, arms crossed, jaw set. I looked up at him. I said, "Chef, this floor drain has a grease accumulation that indicates the grease interceptor is not being maintained on the required service schedule. Can you provide documentation of the last 3 service visits?" He said he'd have to look for it. I said I'd wait. He went to his office. He came back 4 minutes later with a single receipt from a grease trap service company dated 11 weeks earlier. One receipt, no maintenance log, no recurring service agreement. For a facility producing the volume that Taverna Luca was producing, industry standards and county guidelines recommend service every 4 to 6 weeks. I documented the gap. I documented the single receipt. I noted the absence of a maintenance schedule. By the end of the 90-minute inspection, I had recorded 23 violations. 7 were critical violations, meaning they posed a direct risk to public health. The walk-in cooler temperature, the protein holding temperatures, the cross-contamination potential from improperly sanitized surfaces, the sanitizer concentration failure, the dish machine rinse temperature, the chemical storage violation, the absence of an adequate employee health policy, which I discovered when I asked to see their written procedure for excluding sick employees from food handling, and was handed a blank stare. 7 critical violations in a single inspection is severe. 1 or 2 is common for a facility that's been operating without recent oversight. 3 or 4 suggests systemic neglect. 7 suggests a facility that has been treating the health code as optional for years. I stood at the pass where Moretti had been plating his burrata. The plate was still there, untouched, the basil leaf still perfect. I placed the completed inspection report on the stainless steel surface next to it. I said, "Chef Moretti, based on the findings of this inspection, Taverna Luca has received an overall rating of fail. 7 critical violations have been documented. You are required to implement corrective actions for all critical violations within 72 hours. A re-inspection will be conducted after that period. If critical violations remain uncorrected at re-inspection, the facility may be subject to fines, permit suspension proceedings, or closure order per Section 114409 of the California Retail Food Code. Do you have any questions?" He looked at the report. He looked at me, and he said, "You're enjoying this," I said. "I'm doing my job, chef." He picked up the report. He read the first page. He put it back down. His hands were not quite steady. I noticed that the way I notice everything, the way my mother noticed a dirty counter, and I notice a warm walk-in, and Pat Okafor notices a fryer with no temperature log. "You see what you've been trained to see." I gathered my inspection kit. I thanked him for his cooperation, which is what we say to every facility operator, regardless of the outcome. I walked back through the kitchen. Danny was still at his station. He hadn't moved the entire time. The bell peppers were sitting in a pile, half broken down. As I passed him, Danny looked at me. He didn't speak, but he nodded once, a small motion, barely visible. An acknowledgement. Not an apology, because Danny had never personally wronged me. Just a recognition that the person who'd been right 2 years ago was still right, and now had the authority to prove it. I walked through the dining room. I pushed through the front door into the June sunlight on Magnolia Avenue. I stood on the sidewalk and I looked at the restaurant's sign above the entrance. Taverna Luca. Established 2014, I got in my county vehicle. I placed the inspection file in the passenger seat. I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I sat there for approximately 1 minute. 2 years earlier, I had stood in the alley behind that building holding a knife roll and a list of violations that nobody would read. I had been correct about every single item on that list, and it had cost me my job, my income, and 6 months of scrambling to keep the lights on in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. I had been humiliated in front of every colleague I respected for the crime of caring about food safety in a building that served food to the public. Now I had a badge and a clipboard and a 90-minute report that Dante Moretti was legally required to respond to within 72 hours. Not because I wanted revenge, because the walk-in was still at 46 degrees, and the grease trap was still 11 weeks overdue, and the proteins were still sitting in a temperature range that could send someone to the hospital. Nothing had changed in 2 years. The same violations, the same neglect, the same arrogance that says the rules are for other people. The difference was me. I had changed. I drove to my next assignment. A bakery on Central Avenue, small place, family run. The owner met me at the door with a binder full of temperature logs and a smile. She passed with 2 minor violations, both corrected on the spot. I told her the facility was in good shape. She said thank you like she meant it. That's the job, and it's straightforward. Some kitchens are clean and some aren't. You document what you find. The code doesn't have an opinion about who you are or what happened to you in a previous life. It just measures what's true. Taverna Luca's re-inspection is scheduled for this Friday. Whatever I find, I'll document it the same way I documented everything the first time. Station by station, surface by surface, degree by degree. Chef Moretti told me to clean the grease trap or clean out my locker. I chose a third option. I became the person who decides whether his grease trap meets code. If you want more stories like this, they're on the channel. I'll see you in the next one.